Hello and welcome to today's webinar titled Designing Effective Surveys. Now, the target audience for this session is Vista members who are involved in the development or administration of surveys. But regardless of your role within your Vista project, we are glad to have you, and we know that these skills can and will be helpful moving forward in your careers. My name is Chris Hawks. I'm a returned Peace Corps volunteer, or RPCV, serving in Belize from 2010 to 12. I'm joined today by Gina Cardazone, who will be sharing her notes, her professional expertise on survey. So welcome, Gina.
Thank you so much, Chris. I'll share a little bit about myself. I'm a cultural and community psychologist and actually used to do evaluation for AmeriCorps, including AmeriCorps Vista. Right now, I'm the principal researcher at Lean In, where I'm co-author of Women in the Workplace, which is the largest study of the state of women in corporate America.
Thanks, Gina. And I'm going to pass it back to her in just a second. But beforehand, just want to take a quick look at our agenda. So during our time together, we'll cover information that will help you design surveys at your Vista project. We'll walk through the steps to take before creating a survey, then explore different survey questions, and then the third part is to discuss best practices. We'll finish our time together today with a Q&A session, and we hope you will hope to leave you with tools to use in your Vista service at your project sites. Okay, so with that said, I'll pass it to Gina to start us off.
Thanks, Chris. I'm excited about our topic today. I feel like everybody is asked to do surveys at some point in their life, and very few people are actually taught how to do them. So, what is a survey? It's a systematic way to gather information from a group of people. It involves asking people purposefully designed questions to gather information on things like opinions, behaviors, experiences, characteristics, or availability. Surveys can be very helpful tools for managing and supporting volunteers, or for tracking the effectiveness of your project services, or dealing with new organizational needs, just to name a few purposes. By collecting high quality information, you can better understand, evaluate, and make improvements to your Vista projects. So the first step in designing a survey is thinking about how you'll use the information you collect. What is your goal for the survey? Thinking, and a lot of people put stuff in the chat already, so it's great that you have a clear idea. Thinking about your goal for the survey will help you narrow down what questions you want to include. So we can explore a few types of information you might gather and how to do it. And as we talk through these, think about why you joined the webinar, what information you're interested in gathering. If you want to assess the skills of your target audience, you can develop a survey that uses task-based scenarios or self-assessment questions. This information can help you to strategically match them with roles that maximize their talents and benefit the organization. If you're hoping to gather feedback or evaluate the effectiveness of the services your organization provides, you can design your survey to include rating scales or pre-post design, where you collect information before and after their participation. This method allows for measuring changes or improvements over time and provides valuable insight for program development. We'll go more in depth about designing rating scales later in the webinar. If you need to identify gaps or concerns with your target audience, you can use a survey as a tool for need sensing. So this might include open-ended questions around key topics to highlight areas that require attention or improvement, as well as close-ended questions. You might use this information to refine the program or services to ensure a supportive environment. You'll likely use surveys to collect detailed information about your target audience, such as demographics and availability. The information will help you understand who they are, which is key to making your project more inclusive, engaging, and effective. Surveys can track participation data through registration forms or exit tickets, and this helps in understanding trends in community, volunteer, or internal engagement and improving retention strategies. So your purpose should shape your research questions. And research questions are not the same thing as survey questions. They're broad questions that get to the heart of what you're trying to learn. Sometimes they take the form of hypotheses, which are questions that can, have a yes or no answer, while other times they're more open. Someone in the chat earlier said, what are, the barriers to using our services? That's a great example of a great research question that can involve, many actual survey questions. And that often happens where you have multiple survey questions tied to a single research question or hypothesis. For example, if your purpose was to gather information to guide planning on future Vista webinars, you might have a research question like, what topics are Vista members most interested in learning about? And while you could just ask a question like that, you could also ask multiple questions, such as, which of the following skills are you most interested in developing? And select your top two: fundraising, volunteer management, community engagement, so on. And another option is you could ask an open-ended question. What other topics would you be interested in learning about? You could have ranked questions and other things like that. So now I'll pass it back to you, Chris.
Christina, yeah, we're gonna just take a moment here to brainstorm about the information you may want to gather from surveys, and we want to ask you to share in the chat. What's an example of a research question you may want to answer? Ideally, at your project site, something you're thinking about, something maybe your supervisor wants you to address. This Try to think as specifically as possible here. So we'll give you, about 30 seconds to share in the chat and come right back. Right. Thanks everyone for your responses, and can see them coming in very fast now. And Gina, I know they're coming in fast, but do they
Yeah, no,
specifically
I
stand out?
see everything from when are you available for training to how do you learn about our program to what disaster related skills do our members and alumni currently possess. I love that one. It's very specific. And things that are very specific to using a particular CRM program or a particular issue, as well as broad questions like, how can our program best assist you in working on your career goals? So that's great. These are definitely exactly, how can we better meet your needs? These are really great research questions, and it's awesome to have those in mind before you even begin writing your survey. Is make sure you know exactly what your research questions are, what you're trying to find out. So thank you for participating in our chat question. Great responses, and I'm seeing that your research questions are broad and really get to the core of what your survey might be about. So it also helps, in addition to having your purpose and your research questions, before you even begin, putting, designing a single actual survey question, it helps to understand the characteristics of your respondents that may influence whether they take the survey and how they interpret questions. For example, if many of your respondents lack internet access, you wouldn't want to conduct a survey that's only online. You also want to be sure that people can understand your questions, which means you'll want to consider languages spoken and things like education and cultural differences. This can also include industries, since industries have their own jargon. Sometimes you won't have access to all the needed information about your target audience, and you may use a survey to help gather it. There are some questions you may want to include to find out information about the people who are taking the survey. Almost all surveys have at least some kind of demographic questions, unless they're very, very short. So this might include demographic questions or other kinds of questions to understand who your respondents are. Although this seems straightforward, there are several considerations to keep in mind when collecting demographic information. First, ensure that the response options are inclusive and provide write-in options where needed. Also, consider if answering could be sensitive or identifying, and only ask what you need to know. You can even consider making demographic questions optional or select required questions as needed. It's great to make things optional if, unless they're absolutely necessary for your analysis. Otherwise, you have the danger of people dropping out of your survey or, providing false information. So you'll want to gather feedback on questions and response options. And consider including questions at the end after respondents have completed the primary questions of the survey. There's a lot of good reasons for putting demographics at the end. And we'll share a resource which includes more information in the chat. Now let's take a look at some specific inclusivity guidelines. Avoid making questions binary or, forced choice, multiple choice if more than one answer might apply. Instead, you could use a checklist format so respondents can choose multiple options if needed. That might be a little more difficult to analyze, but it could be worth the trade-off depending on the question. Always include an other option if applicable, with phrasing like another option not listed here, and give them the opportunity to specify so that people can identify themselves without feeling excluded. It's also helpful to provide a prefer not to say choice to respect privacy, particularly if you are going to require a question. I think you always want to have a prefer not to say. Tailor your questions to be relevant to your audience. Whenever possible, have someone from your target group review the survey before distributing it. They can help identify any potential issues with language or assumptions. And speaking of assumptions, try not to make any about identity. For example, asking, "What is your husband's salary?" assumes not only gender, but also and sexual orientation, but also marital status and employment. So always use more inclusive language, such as, "What is your partner's salary?" if applicable. It's also critical to avoid grouping unrelated categories together, like combining gender identity with sexual orientation, unless done in a certain way. And be sure to use the language people use to describe themselves or offer multiple ways of self-identifying. This ensures people feel seen and respected. For example, when referring to ethnic identities, there are terms like Latina, Latino, Latine, or Hispanic can be more inclusive. Can similarly consider region-specific terminology, as what's common on the West Coast may differ from what's used on the East Coast or in specific locations like Hawaii. And when talking about gender, it's more inclusive to use terms like man, woman, or non-binary rather than male and female, which refer to biological sex rather than gender identity. So following these guidelines can help you create surveys that are inclusive, respectful, and gather accurate data. So now that we've talked about some ways you might use information gathered from a survey, let's explore a few different ways that you could design survey questions to get the information you need. And we'll spend a good amount of time talking about different types of survey questions. So the types of questions you use will depend on the kind of information that you're trying to collect. When you're designing a survey, you'll typically include a mix of closed-ended questions and open-ended questions, but mostly closed-ended questions. So a closed-ended question is a question where you provide participants with response options, like multiple choice, a checklist, or Likert scale. An open-ended question is when you ask participants to generate or write their own responses. So we're going to review each of these question types and when you might use them, starting with closed-ended questions, which should be the majority of your survey. Survey makers like Google Forms allow you to create surveys with a variety of question types. We're going to place a link in the chat if you want to explore Google Forms. The first closed-ended question we're going to talk about is a Likert scale. So you might not have heard the term Likert scale, but you've definitely seen a Likert scale in your life. In a Likert scale question, participants rate the responses, from high to low, from very little to a lot. It's common to have 5 choices going from, something like strongly disagree to strongly agree, or very satisfied to very dissatisfied. For some types of scales like these, where you have things going from negative to positive, it's really important to balance the response options so the midpoint is neutral and the ends are equally positive and negative. You wouldn't want to start with like slightly disagree and end with strongly agree. So these are often seen in levels of agreement, as the scale on the left of the screen represents, or levels of satisfaction, which the checklist format on the right of the screen demonstrates. A Vista member might use this type of question to assess how a job training program has influenced participants' confidence in finding employment, and just in general for satisfaction. Okay, so we're probably familiar with slider questions from social media, as it's a common way to build interaction into a post. The same principle can be used in a survey for your volunteer program. It may be useful to understanding the level to which someone agrees or disagrees with a statement or idea. It's a kind of a Likert scale, only instead of having discrete options, you slide. So you can use them the same way as you use a Likert scale. Some advantages are that they may be more engaging or intuitive for survey respondents. However, the data can be a bit more challenging to analyze, and it may be harder to include a not applicable or don't know response option. It's also important to include clear instructions to survey respondents that they need to move the bar to indicate a response, or you might end up with missing data. I'll pass it back to Chris now for a chat question.
Thanks, Gina. So again, we're going to take a moment to hear from you in the chat. And our question here is, what kind of question may a Likert or slider scale be useful for answering? So the two that Gina just kind of went over, what kind of question might it be useful for answering? So please share in the chat how you would use this kind of survey question, or maybe an example of when you have used it before, if you have. And again, we'll give it about 30 seconds and come right back. All right, starting to see a lot of the responses popping in. And one thing I just want to quickly note, please, you may have to toggle your response so that you're sending it to everyone. We're seeing a few responses only coming to hosts and panelists, which is great. We get to see it and we love it. But if you want everyone to see your response, you may have to toggle it. But Gina, I'll pass
Yeah.
it to you. Do you see any
Yeah. I'm seeing a lot about satisfaction and feedback. That's a really common use for Likert scales, like I said. I'm also seeing some other uses, so things like assessing your own level of skill, which makes sense. And things like accessibility of a program, which is a dimension of satisfaction, but you might have something even more specific. Was it not at all accessible to extremely accessible? So it can be used to assess familiarity with a concept, safety, how safe you feel when you shop in the neighborhood. So that can go from like very unsafe to very safe, or not at all safe to extremely safe if you want to do it a different way. So yeah, people are very familiar with this kind of question. Seems like people have done this already. But more, often we will end up seeing those in satisfaction or feedback type questions. They're very popular there. So thanks for participating in our chat question. Just as many of you said, you may use this type of survey questions to understand respondent satisfaction levels or their agreement across priorities, as well as a variety of other things such as skill level or, feelings about interest in various topics. Anonymous feedback can be useful here to elicit authentic responses. So multiple choice questions, and honestly, Likert scales and sliders are in a way, Likert scales particularly are just a variation of multiple choice questions. But multiple choice questions more broadly are questions where participants select one response from the responses you provide. So for example, the question on screen asks, how long has it been since your last visit to the doctor? Which has the options less than 3 months, 4 to 6 months, 7 to 12 months, and more than 12 months. Response options should be mutually exclusive and comprehensive. So, for example, if you only had the first 3 options, that would not be comprehensive because you wouldn't have, what about people whose last visit to the doctor was more than a year ago? Again, you don't want to make assumptions. It should be mutually exclusive. So if you had 4 to 6 months and 6 to 12 months, well, what does someone select if it was 6 months ago? Exactly. So that's why, you think about being MECE, mutually exclusive, and comprehensively exhaustive is the shortcut for knowing that. And if you want to provide participants with guidance, but also flexibility, you can include a write-in response option. That wouldn't apply here because you're very comprehensive, but there are other cases where, it really might make more sense. Checkbox questions are like multiple choice questions, but in this case, participants can select more than one response. While it's very important that answer choices don't overlap for multiple choice, or what I sometimes call select one questions, it's not as important for checkbox questions. You don't want a ton of overlap, but it's okay to have some. They can be a little mutually inclusive, especially with demographics. You might have 2 responses that overlap. For example, using a checkbox for question about race allows people to select multiple identities instead of having to choose one. However, analyzing checkbox data can be more difficult. So this is something to take into consideration depending on how you want to analyze your data. Also, if you want to provide participants with more flexibility, you can include a response write-in option, and that often makes even more sense for checkbox questions. A Vista member could use this type of question to identify which resources community members are currently accessing, and answer choices might include things like childcare services, housing support, or transportation assistance. Ranking questions can be useful to understand preferences. For example, this ranking question seeks to understand volunteer schedule preferences. It's a very basic kind of thing that we've all seen, and ask them to rank their top 3 meeting times in order of preference. This person used a program within Microsoft Office to create this question, which is free to anyone who has a Microsoft Office subscription. And it's recommended that if you do something like this, you only ask people to select their top 2 or 3 responses. If you had something like rank your, 1 to 7 of these options, it becomes labor intensive. It takes longer, and also like how meaningful is your 6th versus your 7th choice of something? They're both low. So anything beyond 2 or 3 is usually too complicated. And you can also have an option like select up to 3 responses if you just want people to check them rather than ranking 1, 2, 3. It's the same idea. And there's a link, and we'll share a link to this tool, the Microsoft Office tool, and others to help develop your surveys in the resource list for the webinar. Open-ended questions are questions where participants write in their own responses. So when including these types of questions, be strategic and only use a few of those to provide nuance or to answer questions that can't be answered by a closed-ended question. There's a couple reasons for this. One is that it lengthens the amount of time it takes to actually take the survey if you have a lot of open-ended questions. And another piece is that it also makes it much longer to analyze and synthesize the data. So there are times when it could make sense to have more open-ended questions, like if you have only a few people responding and they're highly motivated to finish and you don't have to worry about them dropping off, like fine, go crazy with your, or just go wild with your open-ended questions. But in general, usually if you're sending it to a lot of people, you want to be strategic, maybe have 1 or 2 open-ended questions. For example, you might find these types of questions when asking for recommendations, finding out why participants chose to volunteer with or donate your organization. Consider how you'll analyze or use responses, and this will help you craft the right questions. And consider inclusion and accessibility. Will all survey respondents be able to fully engage with an open-ended question? Now let's review what we just covered. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks, Gina. And yeah, now that we have gone through a variety of question types that Gina just explained, and all these questions we can use to gather information, we're going to launch a poll right now where you will match questions to survey types. So on one side, you ought to see 4 question options. On the other side, you will see 4 answer options. And I want you to just take your best guess at matching these. So the question options you see are: please rate the effectiveness of the training you received for your volunteer role. How can we make the volunteer experience better for you? What is your t-shirt size? What training or information would help you be more effective? Select all that apply. Those are the 4 question options. And the 4 answer options you see are Likert scale, open-ended, multiple choice, and checkbox. And I could see the responses coming in. Looks like maybe close to half have responded. So we'll give it another 10 to 15 seconds. Make sure everyone gets a chance. Just make sure you click submit after you do match the options. Still seeing some come in. Okay. All right, it's starting to slow down a bit, so I am going to I see a few coming in, but I'll give it a little drum roll, about 5 second countdown to submit your responses. All right, let us close it out and take a look.
Great job, everybody. All right, let's review those answers. And I see there were a couple that people got more easily, and then a couple that maybe, were a little trickier, which is great to have that variety. So rating effectiveness of training, the Likert scale is a great option. We just got done talking about how great they are for rating effectiveness. Most of you got this. For asking how to make the volunteer experience better, an open-ended question is best. And other things, could work, it'd be fine, but Most of you also did say open-ended question, gives people the opportunity to say things that maybe you wouldn't think of. Um, to learn a volunteer's t-shirt size, so the majority of people did say multiple choice, and this is what you would want. The idea is that probably you only have one t-shirt size. Maybe there are a couple sizes you fit into, but for this one, you have multiple choice, you select one, and that makes life easier. Nobody has to make any decision on the other side. And finally, a checkbox can be helpful in learning what information would help you be more effective. Now, a good amount of people, most people, or the plurality of people, or majority of people said checkbox. Some people also said multiple choice or open-ended. And that's true. Like that question could use multiple choice or open-ended. I think in this case, a checkbox is ideal, possibly followed by an open-ended saying like, what other information would help you be more effective? But a checkbox can be helpful because you can think ahead of time about what kinds of things that they might say. But it's usually going to be things that are maybe mutually inclusive. So I hope the exercise shows how different question formats allow you to get the best information you're looking for more efficiently. And now we're going to talk through some best practices. Thank you so much. You guys did great. You all did great. So across these question types, there are a few considerations to keep in mind to make sure you're getting accurate and reliable information um, uh, that meets your goals for the survey. So leading questions are questions that are written in a way that might influence the respondent or include a value judgment. So instead of leading questions, consider how to be as neutral as possible. For example, asking a question like, how does this organization make you feel like you belong? Assumes that they have made you feel like you belong. Double-barreled questions are questions that ask multiple things. This is particularly bad for a multiple choice or rating answer when you can only select one response. To gather more accurate data, consider separating them into different questions so that each question only has one purpose. For example, if you say, how satisfied are you with the program experience and hours? This should be turned into separate questions about the program experience and then another question about the hours. So another thing to avoid is using language or terms with multiple interpretations. This can impact the accuracy of your data if the question or information can be interpreted in multiple different ways. So instead of using unclear terminology or terms that are up to interpretation, consider simplifying your language or defining your terms. So this could include jargon, acronyms, or references that may not be meaningful, like how would you rate the event last week? Yeah, and after drafting your survey questions, check them, and ideally with other people, I'll keep saying that throughout this presentation, to make sure that you haven't made any assumptions that would impact the survey responses or analysis. For example, asking, why are you choosing to remain a volunteer? Assumes that they are choosing to remain a volunteer. Instead, first ask a question about whether they plan to remain a volunteer or for how long, and a follow-up question, which could be an open response question, asking why they responded the way they did. So let's pass it back to Chris now for a very quick poll question.
Thanks, Gina. And yeah, this will be pretty quick on this one, but we want to check in with you about how these survey practices may show up in your Vista service. So we have a scenario here, and in the scenario, our goal is to learn about positive experiences as well as areas to grow for volunteers. The question on this survey is open-ended and asks volunteers to share what did you enjoy about your volunteer experience and what would you like to change? So we're going to launch a poll and just ask you, how could you improve this survey question? Again, the question is, what did you enjoy about your volunteer experience and what would you like to change? The answer options here: A, change this to a ranking question. B, change this double-barreled question into two open-ended questions. C, change this to a true-false question, only focusing on if they enjoyed volunteering. Or D, change this to a Likert scale matrix question. So do see responses coming in, but yeah, we'll still give it some more time. We want to make sure everyone gets a chance to respond. And let's see. Almost two-thirds have responded. if for any reason, yeah, if for any reason you don't see the poll pop up on your screen, feel free to answer in the chat. That's totally fine. Yeah, thanks, Sharice. All right, let's give it about a 5 second countdown again. So, if you haven't submitted, please do so, and we'll close it out. All right, thanks. Um, so thank you for your participation in this review question. And now we want to see how you did. So the correct answer, y'all did great. Of course, you've done great on all these so far with the chat and poll questions. The correct answer here is B, changing this double-barreled question into two open-ended questions will allow respondents to share more meaningful feedback that could help your Vista project. So before we move on to key tips that Gina will go over, I wanted to point out that on your handout there is a guided section to help you develop your own survey question. We'll drop a link in the chat to the handout, but just did want to point that out. And I'll pass it back to Gina.
Yeah, great. And I have a quick follow-up. The other responses weren't necessarily wrong. Like changing this to a question focused only on if they enjoyed volunteering is valid. It would remove the double-barreled problem, but it loses that other aspect. You could also change this into two close-ended questions. It doesn't have to be open-ended questions. And in fact, with open-ended questions, it's not that big of a deal if you ask two questions at the same time. If this was an open-ended question, it would be fine that it was, so-called double-barreled, because somebody could explain this is how I feel about this, and this is what I would change about this. But it's in close-ended questions where double-barreled is really a problem. And so you could change this into two questions, whether close-ended or open-ended, and then you can get what you want out of it. All right, great. So some key tips. Now let's discuss some best practices to keep in mind as you draft your surveys. At the start of the survey, make sure to provide information about the goals, time estimate, and information about who will have access to data and how it will be used. You'll also want to define keywords or acronyms when possible. So this information can be placed at the top of the survey or can be woven into the questions where it makes sense. A tip to keep in mind is to keep it short. Use this opportunity to gather feedback and input. Pay attention to the flow of the survey. For example, consider placing open-ended questions at the end or grouping demographic questions together. Also consider the required or pertinent information. For example, which questions are mandatory and which are optional. Be transparent about what is and is not possible with the data. For example, saying something like, you will get the time slot you prefer, is different from, we need a general understanding of times when people are available. Those who are providing you with the data should know what outcomes to expect from providing their input. And there are some best practices that you want to include to make sure your survey is accessible for everyone. When thinking about the language you use in your survey, consider the language you're making the survey available in. For example, you can use a translator to offer the survey in Spanish, English, or other languages. Also pay attention to the level of language you're using, and remember that the average reading level for adults in the United States is a 7th grade reading level, though your respondents might have a higher or lower level than that. Some tools you can use to check the readability of your survey are in the chat, and it's recommended that you use short sentence length when possible. Finally, you want to make sure that your word choice is clear so that the survey directions and questions are easily understood. Another aspect to consider is the format in which your survey is offered. Including the options to complete the survey in person, via email, or over the phone can increase the reach of your survey. And if you're offering your survey online, consider designing it and making sure that it's mobile friendly. When designing your surveys, you'll want to make sure that they're accessible to everyone. So when possible, avoid using images or videos. Avoid using grid questions as well where possible, because they could be difficult to navigate, especially if someone's taking something on a phone or small surface. I recommend using a font size of 14 or larger, if it makes sense for something that's printed out. And to denote required information or questions, use symbols like asterisks rather than using color. Now we're going to discuss some best practices to consider when administering your survey. I've mentioned this a little bit before, but I'm really going to get into it now, which is when possible, you want to first test or pilot your survey and gather feedback before sending it out on a large scale. So this can be just like an internal peer review process within your organization, but it's also really useful to pilot your survey with some people within your target audience so that you can understand how it's received, especially if you don't resemble your target audience or the people you work with don't. So this feedback will tell you how long it takes, whether there are questions that are confusing or leading or make assumptions, and the kinds of responses you're likely to get from open-ended questions. Think about the tracking approach best suited for your project. Individualized links allow you to follow up with people who haven't completed the survey and send reminders, but they impact anonymity. If you send an individualized link to someone's email, it's not anonymous by definition, but it could be confidential. General links can be anonymous, but then it can be hard to track who's completed the survey or not. One thing that nearly all survey collectors struggle with, and I'm saying nearly all, really, it's all survey collectors struggle with, is getting people to actually take their surveys. Decades ago, it was pretty easy to get people to respond to surveys because there weren't that many of them. Now everyone is obsessed with data and people have major survey fatigue. So it's important to have reasonable expectations about how many people will complete your survey. If you want responses from 100 people, you should probably survey at least 200 people. Everyone says to aim for response rates of 80% or above, but actual response rates can be as low as 2%, as high as 100%. It really depends on circumstances and how motivated your respondents are to complete your survey. Here's some advice for increasing response rates. Number one, think about the best time and place to survey people. For example, if you have an in-person event and want feedback on it, your best bet is to have print surveys available for people to take at the event itself and ask people to fill them out there. Or you can have a QR code directing them to a very short survey that they can take on their phone. Even for virtual events, it makes sense to pay attention to timing. For example, if you want to collect feedback on a webinar like this one, you're much better off sending the survey during the last part of the webinar than sending it the next day. If you've ever used an app like Uber or Lyft, you've seen this in action. You're not sent a survey once a month asking you to rate drivers. You probably wouldn't complete it, and even if you did, you'd probably forget most of what you would say. Instead, you're asked to rate each driver the moment the ride is completed. Make it easy. Number two is make it easy for people to take the survey. It's related to the issue I just mentioned. So getting people at the right time and place makes it easier, but it also means getting rid of unnecessary barriers. If you're sending an online survey, make sure it's mobile friendly so people can answer it on their phones. Don't use a lot of complicated language. Don't make people answer a ton of intrusive and difficult questions right off the bat. Think about what would turn you off from a survey and avoid that. Number three, pre-notify people that they will be getting a survey or ask others to do this. Sometimes you'll have to survey people who will never be together in one time and place, even a virtual place. And in that case, pre-notification can be helpful. This means telling everyone ahead of time that the survey is coming, so when they see it, they know it's real and not spam. If you don't personally know the people you're surveying, it might be helpful to enlist others to help with this also. For example, if you're trying to survey a network of 10 volunteer groups, you could ask the heads of the volunteer groups to tell people at their next meeting that a survey is coming and that it's important they answer it. Number four, think about what's in it for the respondent and offer incentive if possible. This could be a cash equivalent like a gift card, but if you don't have the budget for that, you can get creative. If you're allowed to do lotteries, you can offer a prize for a randomly selected winner who's completed the survey. The prize can be physical or can be some kind of privilege or experience. You may not be able to offer any kind of direct incentive, but either way, you should think about how the respondent benefits. It can mean telling them that you'll share the results back with their team so that they can learn from the survey, or you can appeal to what matters to them, even if they'll never see the results. Say, we'll use this to improve our program. If they know that the data will be used to improve a program, they might be more likely to participate. Number five, assure them that their responses won't be shared with others. If no one, even you, will know who completed which survey, you can say the survey is anonymous. If you can see who answered which survey but won't share that outside your own team, you can say it's confidential. Number six, send targeted reminders every few days. This is for online surveys where you're sending invites directly to people's email addresses, which is recommended. In this case, the data can still be confidential if you don't share it with others, but you can send targeted reminders to people who haven't responded to the survey. I recommend that you send a reminder every 2 or 3 days after the initial invite, and you vary the days and times that you send them. You'll probably see more responses with each reminder, and you can stop when these taper off, which is usually after the third reminder or so. In some survey tools, you can schedule these reminders ahead of time, which makes it very easy. One final note about increasing response rates is that there's a big difference between survey data that's missing at random and data that shows survey response bias. So survey response bias is when one group of people is more likely than others to complete the survey. For example, if half the people in your community only speak Spanish and your survey invite is sent to everyone in English, you'll get a lot more responses from English-speaking people. This is just something to be aware of and try to minimize as much as possible. Finally, send out a thank you. This can help make sure your participants understand the value of their time and information provided. It can also be a great way to keep in touch with participants. Now, we'll briefly discuss some best practices to consider when analyzing your survey. You want to think through analysis when you design the survey. You may wish to look at averages for numeric data like ages, percentages for categorical data like gender, and quotes for examples. Sometimes you'll end up combining categories when you analyze and report data, like combining agree and strongly agree from a Likert scale to give the percentage of people who agree. Consider how to analyze open-ended or other write-in responses, looking for themes, and adding more nuance to numeric responses. When reviewing, be careful not to draw conclusions that are not justified in the data. For example, if 6 or 10 respondents prefer X, does that mean that the majority of all volunteers prefer X? You can also check your findings with participants to see if they resonate or if they have additional insights or interpretations. Let's hand it over to Chris now for a review question.
Thanks, Gina. All right, so we have a review question and a scenario. And in this scenario, Jeremy is a Vista member organizing volunteers at a food bank, which includes many types of roles, including fundraising, helping in the warehouse, and community engagement activities. So Jeremy needs to assess which volunteers prefer which type of work and fill the spots accordingly. And our question here is, which survey question would best help Jeremy fill these volunteer roles? So you should see a poll pop up and you see the answer options A through D. So A, ranking question, B, open-ended question, C, Likert scale, and D, checkbox question. So we'll pause. We'll make sure everyone gets a chance to answer this and think through it. We'll play some light music for about 30 seconds and come right back. All right. It looks like well, about two-thirds have responded, but we'll give it about a 5-second countdown. Looks like some of the responses are slowing down. So if you're almost there, make sure you hit submit and let us close out the survey. Thank you so much for your participation there, and let's see how you did. So, majority got that correct. It looks like the correct answer here is A that we had, where Jeremy could use a ranking question to help him better understand the volunteers' preferences and match them with the best roles. But as Gina, has mentioned, it's not out of the realm of possibility to use other ones. We just A was the preferred option here. Did see several marking D for a checkbox question. Could see that happening. But thank you so much for your participation there. And we'll
Yeah,
move
and I think D
on.
is a good second choice for that. I mean, D would get the job done. I think the key thing in this question was what would help Jeremy prioritize volunteer role preferences. And so the ranking helps you, figure out what the most preferred roles are and would help them prioritize. But if you chose D, you would still get data. It just wouldn't be as informative as the ranking question.
Thanks for clarifying, Gina. So thanks everyone. I know we've covered a lot today. Gina has given us quite a bit to chew on, and we also want to empower you to keep moving forward and improving your survey skills, kind of going forward with your Vista service. So here are some tools we recommend you review for further study. On screen, we've shared the home pages for Google Forms and Microsoft Forms that Gina went over, and the two tools that you can use to build your own surveys. The resource list or handout from today's webinar, which we'll share again in the chat, we'll also follow up with tomorrow, and we'll also post to the Vista campus the handout. It has some great tools for survey design best practices, ways to support equity and demographic questions, some accessibility ideas that I saw a few mentioned in the chat, and also some example survey questions. So definitely encourage you to check out the handout. There's a lot of good information for further study there. All right, and how appropriate here. We'd like to ask you to please complete a survey on our behalf. Your input is extremely valuable on these presentations. We review all the responses, all the content, and it helps us to determine how to improve this for future sessions on this topic. Also to get ideas for future topics as well that you're yearning to have. So it doesn't take long. It's a short survey, and thank you in advance for sharing your feedback. And now we want to turn to Q&A. So friendly reminder, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen to submit your questions. Saw a couple questions in the chat, and we tried to answer them, but just recently I saw someone ask if this recording will be available, and yes, probably tomorrow, no later than Friday, we'll post the recording, the handout, all to the Vista campus. And we'll also send a follow-up email once that's done. So, yeah, look out for that. Looking at some of the questions in the queue, and again, feel free to continue submitting questions. Gina, let's see. I see from Betty has a question. What can you clarify the difference between a research and survey question?
Yeah, and I also do want to call out that you said that there might be a problem with readabilityscore.com. If that's the case, please don't click on that. I'm not sure what's going on, but better to be safe than sorry. You can look Google for sort of like readability scores and other kinds of things, and I think we have some alternatives on there. But in terms of a difference between the research and the survey question, so they can be identical, but basically the research question is the question that you want to answer. The survey question is the question that the participant answers. So the question that you want to answer might be, why are donors dropping out of this program? Or, how do we better recruit volunteers with the right skills? That's not going to be a question that you put on a survey. Instead, it inspires the questions that you ask. And usually you have more than one survey question associated with the research question. So, for example, what are the most I'm trying to think off the cuff, and that's a little difficult sometimes. But if you're thinking about like, if your research question is what are the barriers, you could have several different types of questions. One is like, what are some challenges you've encountered associated with signing up for this program? What are some challenges you've encountered with, maintaining this program, or what is the point at which you've had difficulty? And then have an open-ended question about like what else has prevented you from being able to do this. So these are not great questions off the bat. Survey writing is an art and it takes some time, but to give you some idea of sort of like the question is what you're answering with the survey. The research, that's the research question, or the hypothesis. And a hypothesis would be something like, are people better at this skill after this program than they were before it? That's like a testable hypothesis, which is a form of a survey question. And there's, you could ask a bunch of skill questions to get at that. And so that's what it comes down to. The research question is not something that the person taking the survey sees. It's something that you create before you start writing survey questions.
Thanks, Gina. And I think you touched on it, but just to clarify, because Miriam had a similar type question there, but on that note, if there are, can you have, obviously you can have many survey questions to help answer your research question. Can you have multiple research questions in one survey?
It's a great question. And yes, absolutely. Obviously, it's going to affect survey length. So, if you have a few survey questions per research question, you don't want to have 20 research questions. That means you end up with 40 or 50 questions in your survey, and that's way too many questions. So, I would typically stick with something like 3 to 5 research questions for a standard survey. You could have as little as one research question, or you could have more if you have, if you know that you're going to be sending a longer survey and that you have an audience that will put up with that.
Gina. Okay, yeah, a lot of questions starting to pop in. Let's see. We have one from Sarah. Do you have any advice in regards to the number of pages used within a survey? Does more pages deter more survey completion?
That's a great question. And it really comes down to like the format that you're presenting it in. So a lot of times people will be taking obviously if you have a paper survey, you want to put as many questions as can fit on a page. If you're talking about an online survey, know that most people take surveys on their phones. And so in those cases, a lot of survey tools will actually just give them one question at a time. So like pages are not even meaningful. And I would say like it's not the number of pages, it's the experience. And even like I used to work with the vice president of research at SurveyMonkey. And we would say like how long is the right length of a survey? And he said it does, people actually have pretty long attention spans. What turns them off is things that don't apply to them, things that don't make sense, things that are frustrating. And so I would pay more attention to that than to just length. Are you asking them questions that are irrelevant? Are you asking them questions that are really hard to think about? Are you asking them in a confusing way? And so it's more about the experience. Though obviously you don't want to go on too long. Also for your side on analysis. So yeah, I would say if you do have one of those, if you do have an online survey and you aren't doing the one by one questions like you do for mobile, um, and you have, I would just say maybe make a roughly equal number of questions on each page, especially if you're going to use one of those bars that say like 50% complete. What I found is sometimes that can be a real turnoff for participants if they've answered a ton of questions and it only says 50% complete, but then the rest of the pages are like very short. So just be aware of the user experience, and that's more important than like the number of pages or the number of questions per page.
Thanks, Gina. We might have time for at least one, maybe two more, but this one from Denise, well, it could be a lengthy response, so let's see, Gina. Denise asks, what is the best way to analyze open-ended questions?
Yeah, and that is definitely a question for like a whole other webinar. But it is, you want to know how this is why you don't want to ask too many open-ended questions, is because it does take some time, and there are methods. Sometimes it depends on what your use of the open-ended questions are. You can get away with, depending on how many there are and what your purposes are, of just reading them and sort of internalizing them. If you have, hundreds of responses and you want to do it more formally, there are techniques for basically systematically going through your open-ended responses and doing something called coding, where you're applying a code to each one and grouping them together. And that's, usually what I would do on bigger efforts. But not everybody has time for that. So that's why, if you don't know what you want to ask enough to ask close-ended questions, you probably shouldn't be designing a survey. You probably should be doing interviews and other more open-ended things, and that can help inform your development of a survey. So, so basically you shouldn't have too many open-ended questions. If you do, it might mean that you need to do some preliminary work first and do some interviews or some conversations with people so you can narrow down and get more close-ended questions.
Thanks so much, Gina. And in the interest of time, we'll move on. But anyone who still has an open question, we'll continue to try to answer as many, hopefully all, by the end of the webinar. So hang on if you still have a question that's pending. But to answer one question from someone who mentioned they got in a little late, yes, we are recording this and we'll post the recording and handout used today on the Vista campus likely tomorrow and send out an email once that's done. And to access the materials, you just need to log in and locate the learning path. Once logged in, you can click on Catalog where you see the red square. Well, yeah, it's about to come up on the screen. That will bring you to the learning paths available. It's right at the top, that catalog. Yeah. Now, today's webinar will be posted under the project development learning path. You can search for this or filter by members. And if it's your first time accessing the learning path, you'll have to enroll and join it. That's just a couple of quick steps. And once you've joined the learning path, you can browse through all of the available recorded webinars or e-courses at your leisure. Now, I just want to say thank you for attending today, and we do want to plug our upcoming webinar for next month, The Power of Telling Your Vista Story. So we'll meet again on Wednesday, December 11th, and the webinar will be held at the same time this one was, at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll drop a link in the chat to register, but you can also register on the Vista campus calendar. So if you just go to learn.americorps.gov to the Vista campus, go to December calendar. We'll click calendar from the main menu right at the top and go to December. A blue or green dot will indicate an event for that day. And if you click on December 11th, you'll see the description appear below it and a link to register for the webinar. So you can view upcoming webinars there too. So we hope to see you there. But I just want to give a big thanks to Gina. Gina, thank you so much for your expertise today. Thank you, all of
Yeah,
the
and thank you.
speakers.
Please follow me on LinkedIn or friend me on LinkedIn, and feel free to follow up. I know that we didn't get to every question, so if it's okay with everyone, feel free to ask those questions to me either through LinkedIn or my email or through Vista. I'll try to get to as many as I want. I know that this is you're on your own with a lot of these, so I'm happy to help.
Thanks, Gina. And thanks, everyone, for your service, for your participation today. Muchísimas gracias. This will conclude our webinar, and we look forward to seeing you soon. So thank you so much.
Thank you.